Welcome to Tramlines, a podcast from Agrii. I'm your host, Tony Smith, putting your questions to the experts. In this episode, I'm talking about regenerative agriculture with farmer Tom Martin and Agrii agronomist John Vickery. We will be asking the question, what is regenerative agriculture? Is it something new? And the key question, which is, what are the benefits to growers? So, where do we start? Well, I think the first place to start is to find out where you gentlemen are in the country and what you do. So, Tom, let's start with you. Whereabouts are you based?
So I live and farm just west of Peterborough. We farm actually right up to the A1M on a relatively heavy clay land. And we have a kind of medium-sized family farm here. We farm largely combinable crops and we have a few sheep as well.
Great. And you've got to tell me a little bit about the soil types on your farm, Tom. It seems that you know all of the soil types that not only are on your farm, but what you can see as well. So tell me that story.
That's true. Everybody who farms clayland thinks they farm the heaviest clayland in England. Obviously, I'm one of them. It is relatively heavy clay soil, but we farm the highest hill in Huntingdonshire. Some people will be amazed at 130 feet above sea level. It's nosebleed territory if you're from the east and the fens, but if you're from the west, it's just the foothills. But from our hill in both directions, I can see wonderful soil. I can see lovely peaty lands to the east producing fantastic root vegetables, and to the west I can see lovely light free draining soils. And I'm on a fantastic clay blob here in the middle that really holds its own in dry times, and for the rest of the year it is a bit damp and claggy.
I love the way you talk about your hill. So, talking about going further west, there we will find John Vickery. John, tell us a bit about where you work.
Yeah, Tony, I'm based in the West Midlands in South Worcestershire, but advise an area that covers the Cotswolds out into Herefordshire to the west and the Evesham and Severn Vales in between. So again, like Tom, in our area, we have a huge range of soil and rock types, and our hills are slightly taller. At 1,000 feet at the top of the Cotswolds, it's quite chilly, and the altitude really has shown up this year. A huge difference from the bottom of the hill to the top of the hill. But so huge range of soils where we are. Heavy clay, Evesham series clay in the Vales, and a red Herefordshire marl, and even some sandy sandstone soils around Worcester and Kidderminster. So a real range, Tony, and that's also given us a real diverse range of cropping and farming as well.
I think what's fascinating about listening to you two is that, in a way, you represent such a breadth of soil types that you encounter, whether it's in the farming or as an agronomist. Tom, just before we move on to regenerative agriculture and asking that question, many people will recognise your name and will be aware of Farmer Time. So very quickly, what is Farmer Time? Because I know it's something that you're really passionate about.
Yeah, thank you. We launched Farmer Time 5 years ago on our farm, Village Farm, and we now partner with Leaf to execute it. It's in essence, we pair farmers with classrooms. So each farmer has their own class somewhere in the UK. Each class has their own farmer somewhere in the UK, and we have a series of video calls. Normally every 2 or 3 weeks for about 10 to 15 minutes. The teacher will let the farmer know what they're studying in the classroom at that time, be that climate change or soils or weather or microbiology or genetics, whatever it is. And the farmer, as a farmer, I'll go somewhere that's appropriate on my farm and we'll talk about whatever's going on the farm, whatever's happening in the countryside, and relate that back to the curriculum. So I've stood on the top of a muck heap, I've dug holes, I've seen lambs, I've done absolutely all sorts. And it's great fun, all relates back to the curriculum. And currently we have 700 farmers taking part, always looking for more farmers to sign up at farmertime.org.
What you told me right at the start of the podcast, before we started recording, was that, in fact, you've got a real call out looking for more farmers to be able to connect them to teachers that are waiting to develop that relationship and have that connection with farmers. So good luck with that. And I hope we can come back and talk a bit more about that, because it's got a global reach now, as I understand it. But talking about global reach and talking about education, we ourselves are learning about regenerative agriculture. But here's the thing. What is regenerative agriculture? Maybe, John, you'd like to go first from an agronomist's viewpoint.
Yeah, Tony, it's quite a broad name, and it encompasses a lot of things really. And I think it's a term that we've probably heard more of over the last year or two. But I mean, for me, there's 5 key sort of areas that we need to address within that terminology. So for the first part and the most part, I think a lot of it will be revolving around the abandonment of tillage. So reducing how much you move or cultivate the soils. And in some situations, it's possible to do, very little soil movement at all with some of the technology that we have now. A catch crop, lots of different terminology there, Tony, but we really having something growing in the soil and having roots in the soil and soil cover at all times, it acts really as a soil armor, really, if you want to look at it like that. If you've got bare open soil, really nature doesn't do that. Unless you're in the sort of Sahara. So, having green cover is great. And then within that, having the diversity of different plant species. So if you're growing a crop, whether you can have more than one, companion cropping, that type of thing, or if it's in grass, we're seeing, much more interest in these herbage lays that have a diverse range of species within their swards. And all that then comes to sort of helping water to infiltrate. And I think that's a big area that really affects everybody today, Tony. And we've seen so many times over the last few decades, localized flooding, and all these poor people where we get in these river valleys or even in areas where we perhaps wouldn't associate flooding. And it's a lot to do with fast runoff, rapid downfall events. But if we can actually help some of that water to infiltrate rather than just run straight off the top, then that's good, and also allows us to have water available through the drier periods that we seem to get as well. So infiltration of water, and then finally the sort of holy grail, I suppose, is really to try and integrate some livestock, and that is really an important part of this system and getting the nutrient cycling going.
Yeah, thanks, John. So some really clear points there from your perspective. Tom, on your farm, when we spoke before today, you were talking about the history of your farm, the different generations farming that land. Do you see this talk of regen agriculture as something new, or do you think your farm has seen some of these techniques before?
Oh, Tony, I'm going to give you the political answer, which is yes and no.
Well, that's really helpful.
There was no maybe, though. It was either yes or no. We're definitely actually recovering some of the techniques that we embraced in the past. Obviously, in post-war agriculture, there was a lot of new chemistry that we were able to use to really maximise production, but potentially at the cost of other things. But to really maximise our yields. And as we lose a lot of those actives, as we lose a lot of that chemistry, we're actually having to go back and rediscover some techniques that we used in the past. And often when I speak to my father, he won't thank me for saying that he's just knocked over his 70th birthday. I often think I'm being a bit maverick, and he says, "Oh yes, we always used to do undersowing," or "Yes, we used to do this." But I think equally there are other ways. There's a lot of increasing knowledge in terms of soil, our biology, and how things interact. And so we're bringing in a lot of the new as well as rediscovering some of the old, and we're not abandoning what we would call conventional agriculture either. It really is looking at a kind of holistic, a kind of system-based approach rather than an A plus B equals C approach.
Yeah, and it's really interesting the way you've reflected on some of the other techniques, the older techniques, which are really important now. If we look at what is regenerative agriculture online, you can find many research articles going back, particularly in the States, to the mid-'80s, and then it seemed to go a bit quiet, and now it's very topical. John, why is this phrase, regenerative agriculture, this technique, this way of farming, why is it so topical right now?
Yeah, so I think there are a number of reasons, Tony. There is an increasing knowledge, I think, within the industry and an awareness of particularly soil and around soils. I think for the last sort of decade or so, farmers have really sort of ramped that up, and that's really good. But also going further than that, we're actually seeing, I think, the general idea of how we can use our soil and our farming techniques for the wider good. And there's a lot of talk around carbon and carbon capture, and actually soil holds a huge amount of carbon and can sequester huge amounts of carbon. So again, very topical at the moment with climate change and some of the things that we've been discussing and seeing on the news. So farmers are looking, at ways in which they can actually bring a solution and bring part of the climate carbon crisis, to them, and actually be a positive rather than a negative. So I think there are elements there, and of course the other thing that we've got going on, huge change for UK agriculture, is the restructure of our farming system from the government. We come out of the EU, and we obviously aren't within the common agricultural policy now, and we've got a chance to structure our own policy within the UK. And I think that the way that we're sort of seeing things evolve through that the first snippets we're getting is going to be along the sort of lines that regenerative agriculture brings, as I say, ticking some of those boxes. Public money for public goods. I've already mentioned around flooding and water infiltration. There are some real positives there. Carbon sequestering, as I've just said. I think really it ties in then very much to what Tom does with his Farmer Time. Actually, probably the message is getting the message out there then, Tony. So I think a lot of it is being done, actually quietly behind the field hedgerows, where, we've been doing this for a while, and I think there's been a gentle movement over the last decade or more, and now it's really great that it's becoming a little bit more into the fore, and we really need to embrace it.
Yeah, and some really good points there, John. Thinking then about what happens at a field level, at a crop output level, I'm really interested, Tom. What are you seeing on farm?
In terms of crop output, our crop output is being maintained. We really started to move across to zero tillage about 3 years ago. I have tilled the field this year. I am not a regenerative agriculture zealot, and I have to deal with the conditions that are in front of me. And I think that's important, that we don't just say this is the nirvana and everything else is a disaster. That's not the case at all. But really, in these first 3 years, I wanted to make sure that I was building my soil biology, trying to start building my soil carbon, and making sure that I was widening my rotation, doing some of the other elements as well. And we're starting to see some big differences in our soils, in our soil structure, in the way that we retain and deal with water. But really, in these initial phases, when I started to make some big changes, I just wanted to make sure that we weren't going to be losing yield, and that certainly seems to have been the case in the last 2 to 3 years, as we've started to move across here. And it means now that actually, once we've kind of got into the flow of things, we can start making further changes. This year, I'm reducing my fungicide applications, or I'm not reducing, I'm targeting them far more effectively. It's been quite a dry year. I've been able to reduce them back, and I've done that by looking at the nutrient requirement of my plants as well. So I've got a little bit obsessive about tissue testing, about soil testing, and trying to answer some of those more diverse problems, rather than just trying to find, as I say, an A plus B equals C solution. My wife said to me the other day, "Tom, you're a bit of a soil geek, aren't you?" And I said, I think I might be. And she said, "It's okay, I like it." So it's good to be passionate about these things.
Yeah, absolutely. And I can really hear that. What do farmers notice that's different in the way the land looks with these different tillage approaches? Is there anything that looks different?
Oh, well, I can definitely answer that. I'm sure, John, you can add to it as well. Your farm looks a mess for a far greater portion of the year than it did under conventional tillage. And this has been a real issue for particularly for other generations who are used to seeing the soil, the fields looking square and uniform colour in the autumn. And when we're trying to look after our soil, of course, we're not exposing it. We're trying to cover it with crops with diverse rotations or with cover cropping, and really just to not disturb it, not to meddle with it and mess it up. So how does it look? Well, I tell you what, it definitely looks a little bit more unkempt through those winter months, but it has massive advantages as well. So we were talking with a neighbouring farmer in November. It happened to be one Friday when the heavens opened. Everything we had all seasons in one day, and we walked across a field that would normally be ankle deep in mud and clay. And actually, it walked incredibly well. And I know that's only an anecdotal thing, but it's really a great symptom of what's happening below the ground, how it's able to cope better with the extreme weather conditions, or the increasingly extreme weather conditions that we get, and still produce. So.
Yeah, and I really hear, Tom, that you're blending that farmer gut instinct of noticing how the land feels and what's different, and using existing science and new science to really produce your crops. John, let's bring this together. Can we put some financial values on what this can mean for growers?
Yeah, I mean, there are some obvious wins, Tony, in many ways, depending on where you are and what sort of techniques you're employing. But certainly we've seen where we're using a more diverse rotation with low disturbance drilling and so forth. Actually, I would say our fuel consumption goes down, because we're tending to use machinery that is a lot less, that requires a lot less horsepower. We're using direct drills, that type of thing. So there's some easy wins there. And also, Tom was talking about fungicides. Certainly, I think one of the first areas we've seen is probably with herbicides. Actually, if you're disturbing less soil, and particularly if you're able to incorporate some of the longer term grassland type species within it, and that brings livestock in, then there's really a real reduction in the number of herbicides for things like blackgrass, which has been obviously a big challenge for UK agriculture. Just like Tom, I would concur that generally the yields, probably, that if we can keep them at a reasonable level, similar to a more conventional traditional system, that's good. And I think then the costs really of production are what are bringing the financial savings. It's about that saving in inputs really, more than necessarily boosting huge yields.
And there's so much to talk about, isn't there, with regards to this topic? But if you were to leave us today with one top tip that you'd like to offer to both agronomists and also farmers and growers in the UK, let's start with you, Tom. What would that top tip be with regards to regen agriculture?
It would be relevant to regen agriculture, and beyond that is that there are some key factors on my farm. Weather is one of them, world markets are another one, and then I'm the other one. I can basically really screw things up, or set my farm up to be as profitable as possible. I'm the difference, and actually it's really important that we invest in ourselves. Now that means obviously taking a bit of time out when we need to take a bit of time out, but it also means in firing our grey matter, in getting out there. There's loads of amazing things. Agrii are doing some fantastic trials all over the country. HDB, lots of other organisations providing different inputs, and it's great to get out, meet other farmers, get a bit of input, and use that to energize yourself and kind of drive yourself on, and to be inspired. And there's some great reading out there as well, I would say. Really kind of don't be afraid to focus on yourself, because you can really screw things up as a farmer, or you can be the architect of your own successful future.
Well, I really like the "or" that you put in there, Tom. And John, from your perspective, what top tip would you like growers to think about right now with regards to this regen agriculture?
I think every farmer really needs to think carefully about what they're doing and why they're doing it. I think they need to think carefully about how much they drive on the soil. I would encourage every farmer to try and think of their field like their own flower border in their garden, and you've got to ask yourself, why am I driving on it? Why am I cultivating it? Why am I doing this? I think that's one of the first steps is don't do recreational tillage.
Thanks, John, and thank you also, Tom, for your time today, and more importantly, for sharing your incredibly valuable insights as to how you're putting regen agricultural techniques into play on farm. That's it for this podcast, but do tune in again as we meet the experts throughout the season, exploring the many immediate and longer-term questions for growers and farmers in the UK. If you have any questions that you'd like us to ask the experts, email info@agrii.co.uk. See you next time.